Chapter 16, Initializers, Solution Movie 16.1. So in this exercise, we're going to apply what you've learned about initializers to enhance the sample code you created in exercise 15.1. So our first step says open the inheritance playground, and I've got that open over here. This is the playground we created for exercise 15.1. So our second step, in the person class, add a designated initializer that accepts first name and last name parameters and stores these values into the corresponding properties. I'll come over here. I like to put my initializers directly below the properties and before the other methods. So I'll type init, and it takes first name, which is a string, and last name, which is a string. So we can take these parameter values and store them in the properties. Self.firstName equals first name. Self.lastName equals last name. In the person class, add a convenience initializer that accepts no parameters and calls the designated initializer. So I type convenience, name of the method, no parameters, and curly braces. So let's add code that calls the designated initializer. Self.init. At this point we should be seeing code completion, and we're not. It's a bug in this version of Xcode. But I know what to type, so I say first name. I'm going to pass in an empty string. Last name. And again an empty string. All right, our next step. In the patient class, add a designated initializer that accepts patient ID, first name, and last name parameters. All right, so we'll come down here, and again below the properties, here's my designated initializer. And I'm going to accept patient ID, which is a string, first name, and last name. So we take the patient ID and store it in the patient ID property. Again, I like how the use of the keyword self indicates to me that this is a property, instead of just saying patient ID equals patient ID. Now we can call the superclass initializer. So we say super.init. It does show up in code completion. Pass in our first name parameter, press tab. For last name, we pass our last name parameter value. Right, and that's our designated initializer. For our next step, in the patient class, add a convenience initializer that accepts no parameters and calls the designated initializer. So we took the word convenience, init, accepts no parameters, and now it needs to call the designated initializer. So we say self.init. Again, it's not popping up in code completion, but we'll type what we need. So we'll pass in patient ID of empty string, first name, and last name. So now for our final step, we can test what we've created here. We can change the code at the bottom of the playground to use the new designated initializers to create instances of the person and patient classes. So I scroll down here. Click right here and I get rid of the opening paren. If I type it again, I can see it pops it up in code completion. I press return. So for first name, I'll pass in John Doe. It's throwing in an extra parenthesis for me, so I'll get rid of that. Now we come down to patient. I'll get rid of both of these. And for our patient ID, I'll pass in 1, 2, 3. And for our first name, I'll pass in John Smith. Okay, so now we've got two instances, and we're using our brand new initializers to get the job done. Now you'll notice that this all works the way it should. Person is John Doe, patient is John Smith, and it's returning it the way it should, properly formatted for the patient name. Now if we want to test how our required values work, let's go ahead and we'll get rid of this. And here you can see that for person, everything's okay because we're passing in the required information. But for patient, we've got a patient ID that's missing. And every time we send an empty string in, it's going to tell us that this class has some required information that is not being entered. So everything's working great.